This video is brought to you by my fantastic Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join them and help to offset some of my production costs, then please click on the link in the description below. Pricing starts from as little as a cup of coffee each month. This week I commence building something that isn't a tracked piece of armour. Okay, so it does have a track system, but really it's a whole other class of vehicle. ICM's 135 Sd.Kfz.3b Maultier replicates a German general-purpose 3-ton truck that was fitted with the track system in place of the rear wheels. Used in most combat zones where the Wehrmacht was operating, they saw extensive service. I'll be building this as an early entrant into the war, which was then sent to North Africa with the Deutsche Afrika Korps in early 1942. So this video is part 1 in a series that will look at construction and modification. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to my usual method of construction, and rather than show every step of removing parts from sprue, cleaning them, gluing them together and following the instructions, I'm going to do what most advanced modelers do and completely ignore that. I'm going to skip through those tedious processes and focus on how I did most of the modifications on this kit. Because after all, that's the really interesting part of this construction process. So what modifications did I make? Well, there was a headlight canvas cover made using tissue paper, a set of full model metal tracks from a Panzer I, fuel drums as stowage, tie-down points around the rear tray made from thin gauge wire, modified the external jerry can holder. I made a canvas tarpaulin from tissue paper, and that's old school modelling right there. Making ropes from copper wire, I made metal hoops for the structure for the canvas tarpaulin. I installed a headliner to the cabin interior, and I've been making leather covered seats. So when making a large canvas tarp from tissue paper, we need some structure to it. So I used 4 layers of tissue paper, as that seems to provide enough strength and flexibility in the finished material. I cut the tissue paper to size, and remember, truck tarps have long sections both front and rear, so you need to include those in the measurements if you're doing this. Using VMS paper shaper, I wet the edges and fold the thin edges to make a turned seam. And this mimics how these were actually made in real life. I need to take my time with this as the tissue paper really is quite easily torn, and the VMS paper shaper will make it stick to whatever surface it is in contact with. Hence why you see I'm using a plastic liner underneath. After folding the centre seams which reinforce the tarp over the metal rails, I used a metal ruler to push the tissue flat and remove most of the uneven wrinkles. I used more of the VMS paper shaper to soak the tarp and then stick it to the model itself. The working time with this product is generally up to 40 minutes for me. I find tissue paper is a great material to use, and it will conform to whatever is beneath it. In this case, a spare truck wheel on top of several fuel and oil drums, and it can be manipulated into whatever shape you need it to be. Now it's just a matter of progressively wetting the tissue paper, then moulding the tarp to achieve the shape that I'm after. The tissue can be easily worked to conform to any shape. Given that it's 4 layers thick, it is fairly fragile, but still suitably strong enough for our purposes. I guess I'm saying, take a little care if you too use this method. The applicator bottle of the VMS paper shaper allows me to apply the right amount of product just where I want it, and that's a real strength of this approach. Personally, I find the tissue is easier to work with than epoxy putties, and it gives me a better result as far as in-scale fabric appearance, especially when we're talking about canvas. As I work the tarp into position, I'm being mindful of how the crew would probably have folded it. And I think that's the key to having something that looks in scale and realistic versus something that's just thrown onto the model, because every armour modeler these days uses tarps and oil and fuel drums as stowage. The supplied seats in this kit are essentially flat boring pieces of plastic. And I wanted the seats in this truck to show that they are padded and have an in-service look after having been used for several years. So I covered the supplied seats in the kit with a 2-part Tamiya epoxy putty and shaped the seats to resemble leather covering. Once dry, they're primed in Mission Model Paint black primer and then painted using acrylics by hand. So whilst I lay out the paints here on my wet palette, let's talk a bit about colour theory and paint application for this process. By using a black primer, I'm making a deliberate choice to use a very dark colour as the base. Often known as black basing, this allows me a huge margin of error when the top coat coverage is painted too thinly. The black will act like a dark stained underlying base. This also means that all colours over that black base will shift tone slightly. Now, I can of course elect to apply additional top coats or apply each top coat heavily to increase the paint's opacity. And that's if I wanted the top coat to be one solid true colour. But that would look pretty unrealistic in this case, even cartoon-like. So I want the surface to be uneven, worn, used, and really just a little dirty. Let's face it, soldiers are rolling around inside this cabin and, we're not known for keeping things really clean. Certainly not in a dusty, dirty environment like the desert. And here is where that choice with the colour tone shifting comes into its own. By being deliberately uneven in my approach to applying the red-brown top coat, I make the leather look much older than it should be. Using long deliberate strokes with a brush, I'm applying a thin coat which will leave a hint of the darker undercoat to be seen through the top coat. This reinforces that darker tonal shift which I mentioned earlier and adds age to the leather surface that I'm trying to create. Back to the wet palette. Next I'm mixing the chipping colour, so bold is best. I need a strong colour mix so that the scratches and marks that I'm going to apply will really stand out. The bright tones here will do exactly that. These bright colours used to distress the leather really take our weathering to the next level and make the vehicle look lived in. The Armour modeler's best friend, sponge chipping. So with a sponge that's been slightly dampened with water, I apply the bright chipping paint to those areas on the seat where I think that the driver and his friends are going to wear the leather and add some damage and age. The next step will see me apply a dark wash which will bring all of this together. But for now, the chipping mix will appear to be very stark. When applying the chipping, concentrate on the areas which would receive the most wear in real life, such as the edges of the seat. Don't be too worried about overdoing it, you can always reapply the base layers if you need to. I also apply the same distressing techniques to the upper seat section. The driver is certainly going to wear the edges of the seat back as he enters and exits the cab. With the first stages of distressing and wear completed, it's now time to move to the next stage, an oil paint wash. Applying a dark brown oil wash over the seats, including using some dabs of strong colour, will greatly enhance the dirty and worn appearances of the leather. This wash will tie in all of the subtle and not so subtle colour variations in the seats. The bright scuff marks and cuts will be toned down and the overall appearance will be that of well-used 5-year-old seats. Once I've covered the seat, I then add dabs of oil paint in a heavier opacity. The aim here in doing that is to add more dark wear marks, knowing that I'll be adding some light dust over that as the final layer. The thinner that's already been applied is probably enough, so just keep working at adding dabs of dark oil paint and blend them in around the edges. The key to this heavy weathering is to overdo the early layers, as the final layers of dirt, washes and dust will bring it all together. The last step in this is going to be a little dry earth pigment that'll be applied over the seat surfaces once the cabin's been fully built. A couple of final touches, including adding dry pigments for dirt and dust. And in this instance, I'm using a custom desert colour combination that has a lot of yellow-based earth tones. I use Mission Models thinner to bind the dry pigments to the floor surface, and as always, I'm working in layers. Final layer is a very light brush application, stuck down using thinner, spat through the airbrush. You'll also notice that I've installed the dash and headliner, and that's it for part 1. The aim of the first phase was to build the truck into sub-assemblies that can be more easily painted and weathered. The 3 main groups, the chassis, the cab body, and the tray, are now complete and test fitted, as you see here. 2 things about this kit have become apparent during this build. A, it's a little fiddly to build, but really that's just part of its charm. And B, it really does lend itself to being upgraded. These trucks are rewarding builds if you choose to put the time into the modifications and make a story out of it. And really that's the future direction for this kit. It's going to become part of a diorama set in Tunisia in mid-1943. As my patrons know, the build has moved into the next phase already, painting, weathering and super detailing, even the underneath of the truck, because that's what we dedicated modelers do, right? See you all next week, and thank you again for watching.